This episode of Liquid Assets is sponsored by HASA, the leader in water treatment solutions. HASA delivers eco-friendly, reliable, and cost-effective water care and has been keeping communities safe, one drop at a time. They've been at it for more than 60 years, and you can learn more about HASA by visiting hasa.com. That's HASA, HASA.com. Welcome to Liquid Assets. I'm your host, Ravi Kurani. Liquid Assets is a podcast that covers the world of water through the lens of management, technology, and business, all as it revolves around this world of water. Today, we have an awesome guest for you. We have Jay Bernas. Jay is from HRSD. Jay, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm Jay Bernas. I'm CEO for the Hampton Roads Sanitation District. We're located in Eastern Virginia. And in this podcast, you're going to learn all about innovations in wastewater.
Yeah, it's great that you're here. Why don't you go ahead and just kind of quickly tell us who you are, where you're located, where you're dialing in from, and just give us like a quick high level of what is HRSD.
Yeah, so again, Jay Bernas, General Manager, CEO of HRSD, which stands for Hampton Roads Sanitation District. We are in Eastern Virginia, and we are a wastewater-only utility. We were created in 1940, so almost 85 years now. We've been serving Eastern Virginia specifically for wastewater. So now we've grown into the 14th largest wastewater utility in the country. Arguably one of the most innovative utilities in the country. Hopefully we'll get to talk about some of the stuff we're up to. But yeah, that's the quick synopsis. We serve 20 cities and counties, 1.9 million people. Yeah, and just really happy to be here to help tell our story.
It's amazing. Kind of a few questions. Let's just unpack that. You say that you're CEO and president of a wastewater company. For people that don't know, I would probably ignorantly think that wastewater is like a city or a county thing. Like how... Is it a private organization? Are you the CEO? How does that work? What does it mean to be a CEO of a wastewater company?
Yeah, so it's a great question because we're actually unique in the Commonwealth of Virginia and a little relatively unique in the country. When we were created in 1940, the powers that be, by the General Assembly of Virginia, the powers that be realized that not any one city can build wastewater treatment plants and have the expertise to build wastewater treatment plants. And so in their infinite wisdom, they created a regional authority. So now we serve 20 cities and counties. And so we have these great economies of scale, and why we have the largest R&D group in the country, why we have one of the largest municipal labs on the East Coast. That economies of scale is really important. So we are a quasi-state agency, so we're not for profit. We're more like a government agency. And so we have 500,000 households that we serve. And so we send a bill. So the way our utility works is we send a wastewater-only bill to every household that's connected to the sewer system, and they pay that bill, and all the revenues stay with us. So we don't share any money with the state or any other entity. So all of that is like an enterprise fund, and so all that stays within our utility.
And maybe another dumb question, but what does it mean to be a quasi-state or quasi-city entity? If you guys are taking in all the revenues and keeping it and don't have to share it, are you just a private nonprofit? What is the...
Yeah, it's kind of like that, right? That's why it's kind of hard to describe what a regional authority and what they are and how they operate. But it's basically, yes, we don't make a profit. We're a government agency, but we're not quite a full state agency, and we're not quite a city. We're kind of like in that middle of just being a regional authority that's quasi-state. We basically operate under a number of different state rules, like on procurement, on like how we have to acquire a new engineer and things like that. We have to bid out projects, those kinds of things. So we have to follow all kinds of state rules, which is kind of like why we consider ourselves quasi-state. So yeah, I'm sure that's helpful for folks that are not familiar with many utilities and the different forms that they come in. Because in many times, some of your listeners may pay their wastewater bill to the city of Philadelphia, right? And so they're structured much differently. They could be part of a city government, where we are outside. We're a regional entity. So
really interesting. It just as a short aside, I remember this John Oliver clip where he was talking about the kind of districts of the United States, and there, we obviously have the federal government in the states, and then you have counties and cities. But there's this whole world of the electrical grid and the boundaries kind of go in between or, outside of cities and counties. And there's the water grid. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. But I'll post a link. It just kind of reminded me. I'll post a link in the show notes to that as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the most unique things about our utility, and I think from a governance structure, it's a great example of a good governance structure that just works, is that our board, our we call them our commission, they are governor appointed. So they're not elected officials and they don't have any term limits. So basically, they're able to take long term views, focus on just making the right decision because these are volunteer positions. There's no salary, they're not getting paid. These are citizens of our region that just really believe in doing the right thing. And so many of our commissioners have been on for 10 plus years. And yeah, so our mission to protect public health and environment, and that's what they're focused on. They're not focused on getting reelected or any of those kinds of things. They, again, like especially for a service like wastewater, where it's so important to protect public health and the environment. You really just need to be doing the right thing and making good decisions for the community. So I think it's a good lesson we're a good case study in good governance and a good example of how a regional entity can operate very successfully.
It's awesome, and we're going to touch on a lot of that when we get into the R&D, because you guys are doing some really really cool stuff. I'm going to still stay kind of at the table stakes really quick. So just kind of summarizing, you guys were formed in like the 1940s, Commonwealth of Virginia. You guys are the 14th largest wastewater utility, and you guys are kind of this like regional authority, quasi government, and have to comply with some of the state stuff, but keep all the revenues. You guys send like a separate bill to the people that you serve. Even dumber question, just what is like wastewater, right? You had mentioned that you send a bill to the homeowners. Like, do you take all of the stuff that comes out of your shower and your toilet? Like, just walk us through what it actually means around the life cycle and the kind of input, the output of where water comes from and where does it go to?
Oh, that's a great question because, we did a survey a couple of years ago. We asked a very simple question: where does your water go? 60% of our customers had no idea. They had no idea. They think that wherever it goes down the drain goes straight into the river, to the ocean. It's like, no. That's not how it works. And so basically, because we are a wastewater only utility, yes, for sure, what you flush down the toilet, what goes in your sinks, when you're washing clothes, all that drain from your house leaves your house through typically a sewer lateral. And typically goes into a gravity sewer system in your road. So you probably have seen manholes, depending if you live in a subdivision or whatever. You've seen manholes in the road. Underneath the roadway are the series of sewage pipelines that carry, and you hear the saying, stuff flows downhill, right? And so that all flows downhill and eventually makes it to the wastewater treatment plant. And so in Virginia, because many of the wastewater plants discharge into the Chesapeake Bay, it's the country's largest estuary and it suffers from nutrient pollution. All of the wastewater plants that discharge into the bay are probably the most advanced water treatment plants in the world. It's kind of interesting to note that because you go to different places and everybody treats their wastewater differently, but no, it does not go straight into the river stream. It goes through a very complex series of wastewater treatment processes to get to a point where it's highly treated effluent. It's maybe not be drinkable, but it's pretty good to go back into our waterways. And again, it's protective of public health and the environment.
I've been just hearing about these like gray water systems, the black water systems. How did those work within the wastewater ecosystem? Like, I feel like that would be less revenue for you guys, right? Because if I'm recycling my water, then I'm sending less back to you. And so is there kind of this incentive, or is it better to do that? Like, what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, so I mean that's a multi-layered question because the business case doesn't work if you don't have people connected to the public sewer system, right? And so in many localities, they actually have mandatory connection requirements where if there is a gravity sewer fronting your house, you have to connect to that gravity sewer, right? Because let's say only 50% of those folks connected and you're only receiving 50% of that revenue, but it costs a lot of money to build that sewer line into that road. That math doesn't work. And so the majority of developed cities have these mandatory connection policies. So you won't necessarily see those types of systems in an area where they have a sewer system. So conversely, if let's say you're out in the country, it doesn't make sense to spend the money to install a sewer system because it'd be a house for every 10 acres, right? And so that business case doesn't work. And so then you have to get into these septic tanks and other alternative systems. And, although it's less revenue for the utility. There's no business case to run sewer out in these rural areas where you don't have enough connections to support the revenue to make up for the cost to install all that infrastructure.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And I remember this kind of parallel example of, I think it was PG&E in the Bay Area. And from an electrical standpoint, there's a similar issue with like solar and the electrical grid, right? Because we've laid out all of this wire, all of these towers with, wires going through them. And it takes a lot of money to run and power that infrastructure. And a whole bunch of solar that comes on the roof basically creates this kind of disincentive or even loss of revenue for the electrical grid. And like, it totally makes sense of how do you kind of make both of those, even as we want to go decentralized, you're also losing out some of the benefits of all this capital we've invested in the centralized side of things.
Yeah, and it actually just happened to us like 3-4 months ago where we had a pipeline we were going to build. We thought it was going to be a $30 million pipeline. We were going to take all these folks off septic tanks and things like that. Well, that pipeline ended up being $80 million. And so when you did the math, we could have probably bought every single one of those properties. You know what I mean? For that kind of money, for the number of properties that we were going to end up serving. So we ended up killing that project. So again, as a utility, we really are conscientious about making sure that we are smart and good stewards of ratepayer funds and we make good business case decisions. So
yeah, definitely. Let's kind of double click into what actually happens at the wastewater plant. So you've explained that you connect to the sewer line. There's a complex network of a bunch of this piping that goes into your facility. And once the water reaches there, I guess walk me through like how much water is this, first of all? Like if you can just kind of maybe put it into perspective, gallons, or is it like a really large pipe? And then once it actually gets into the wastewater facility, how do you get it clean enough? You mentioned it's not drinkable, but it's safe to go back into the Chesapeake Bay. Walk me through kind of like what that looks like.
yeah, and so the average household roughly uses about 100 gallons per day of water that gets discharged into the system. And so for wastewater plants, they could range from like 50,000 gallons today to one of our largest plants is 54 million gallons a day. So, but the wastewater treatment process is biological. As we all know, people, humans, animals, everybody poops. There's a whole book that everybody poops, right? And nature takes care of that, right? It's a natural process. And so similarly, wastewater treatment process is a biological process. You contrast that with how water treatment works. It's very chemical. A lot of the processes to treat drinking water is chemical, but wastewater is really all biological. So you want to have the bugs that can break down all the waste that you send to it. So wastewater treatment in its simplest form is you're trying to separate the liquids from the solids initially, right? And so you have all these series of equipment and clarifiers and things like that, separating liquids and solids and going through a number of different steps before it actually gets released. And so there's a whole liquid train and a whole solids train on how each one gets treated before they get discharged into the environment. I think on the solid side, what ends up happening is about half of the country uses something called land application, where basically the biosolids gets to a certain point where they use it as fertilizer for farms. And then on the liquid side, obviously it could go into a lake or stream or into the ocean or into the bay, but it has to be of a certain quality. And so wastewater is just a very highly regulated process. And so there's so many requirements on, I think, we do over 50,000 tests a year in terms of making sure that we meet all of those regulatory requirements before that water is discharged into the receiving stream.
What are some of the technologies that you use to kind of separate out the solids from the liquids? And we can get a little technical here just as a kind of a flag for the audience. What technologies out there? It sounds really interesting to be able to separate liquids from solids and then be able to turn the solids into fertilizers. And then a separate question is what happens to the liquids to make sure that they're not toxic, or maybe they aren't, but what does that look like?
Oh, so that's a good point about the toxicity. So for municipal wastewater plants, for the most part, you are not allowed to discharge industrial waste to a wastewater plant because the wastewater plant is a biological process. If you discharged a bunch of chemicals and it wiped out all the bugs, then that whole natural process of deammonification or taking ammonia to nitrate or some other form, all those bugs would be gone. Another good analogy is like if you've ever had a fish tank, that whole nitrification cycle in the wastewater is high in ammonia relatively, and ammonia is very toxic to aquatic life. And so you really want to break that ammonia down into a different form the holy grail is taking ammonia to nitrogen gas. But anyways, so on the chemistry side, that's kind of what you're trying to do, is you're trying to get that, break that ammonia down to a different form. So some typical wastewater processes. First, you've got the mechanical part. So it's called the headworks. The wastewater goes in, and basically it's screening, right? And you find, they found that our folks have found some crazy stuff in the screens, like logs and bags of money and all kinds of crazy stuff you find in these screens, because you imagine people dump all kinds of stuff in the wastewater. And so you have the headworks, and that does mechanical screening. Then typically you have a primary clarifier, again, separating the liquids of the solids settle out, and then the liquids skim over. And then you have like an activated sludge process. That's where you're adding oxygen to the process, and you're creating an environment for the bugs so they can break down all of those wastes and turn it to that whole nitrification part. And then sometimes you'll have secondary clarification, and then maybe tertiary treatment. Those are kind of the general processes that are involved in the wastewater process.
And these would just be smaller and smaller filters, basically. So you're just kind of like siphoning the water or pushing it through smaller and smaller filters. So you catch like the logs and the bags of money on the first large filter, and then you just kind of bring it down. Or how does that work?
So like typically clarifiers are round concrete tanks. And then aeration basins are typically more like rectangular, and they could have different configurations where they could have anoxic zones, anaerobic, different zones where, because oxygen related to that whole nitrification cycle is important on whatever you're trying to remove, nitrogen, phosphorus, those kinds of things. And then you have secondary clarification to get it even more clean and more liquids and solids settling before it actually makes it out through the effluent.
And you had mentioned just a few minutes ago that obviously industrial applications should not be discharging their waste, because you're primarily just taking, home waste, which is poop and pee. Yeah. And then you use the kind of natural biological process for that. But what happens with industrial? And I guess kind of even an even question above that is, what is industrial? This is like chemical plants, like waste that otherwise would not be biological.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, like chemical or any type of industry, like, metal fabrication, those kinds of things where there's actually laws about what you can and can't discharge. So we have a whole group called pollution prevention. We call our P3 group. Their whole job is to permit all of the industries that discharge to us that could have potentially an impact on our wastewater system. And so these are all national requirements for anyone discharging to the wastewater system. Yeah, to the point of, we don't want to wipe out all of our bugs that would totally destroy the wastewater process. And so, yeah, it could be chemicals. And so, we may require them to do pre-treatment systems before they discharge to us. So we do testing. And so all of these permits for these industrial dischargers, we manage all of that.
Really, really interesting. If I look at the pie of wastewater, what's kind of the percentages, if you know, of like regular household water that's your biological waste versus stuff that needs to get treated from the industrial standpoint? Like how much out of all of the outflow or inflow of water that's coming that is considered waste, what's the kind of breakout in terms of just percentages, I guess?
I think it varies. Like in our region, we really don't have a lot of industrial dischargers per se on a relative basis, but there are other areas that might have a DuPont or a Dow, you mean those kind of large chemical companies within their service areas. That's just totally different. And so it's hard to give an average because it just really depends on kind of where you are and what service area that you're serving. So what's interesting about HRSD is we have 14 wastewater plants. And the reason we have 14 is because our region is very flat, right? And so that's very different than like DC Water that serves Washington, DC, where they have one mega plant. Or in LA, they have one mega plant. And so the fact that we have so many little plants, well, relatively, is really a function of our topography and how flat our region is. So, but again, it's like, that's why our service areas, meaning to say that our service areas for each plant could be a lot smaller than maybe one of these mega plants where their service area is just massive.
Sure. So. Yeah. And if somebody was a bad actor, how would you be able to figure that out? You mentioned you do a bunch of testing, but like, do you know kind of the input streams of, hey, it's coming from this particular geography or this area? How would that work to make sure that your bugs don't die, right? Somebody just doesn't dump something in, then you like have to fix it up later.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And so that's one of the reasons from a permitting standpoint, we need to know what they're discharging. And so we get an initial assessment of like kind of what their effluent is. And then like let's say we have some die off or inhibition of the wastewater plant, or for whatever reason, we'll do testing of the water and to see, it's like, whoa, well, is it acrylamide or is it some chemical? It's like, we know exactly who discharges acrylamide, and then you go back to them. But generally, most of the permittees are pretty good, and if they have like an accidental spill, they'll let us know. They'll give us a heads up ahead of time. But that's the whole part of the permitting process, and the relationship that our folks have with industry, that it's not like, hey, we want to beat you up. We need to work together, because at the end of the day, industry doesn't want to kill all the bugs either, right? And so that's why it's really, we work through relationships as opposed to like, hey, we're going to regulate you, blah, blah, blah. We're kind of into this together, and that's kind of how we approach things.
Awesome. Jay, I want to take a quick pivot to diving into the R&D of what you do at HRSD, because I feel like that's kind of your feather in your cap, because you guys are just, and that's kind of how we connected. Walk us through that. Like, what does it mean to do R&D at wastewater? Do the majority of wastewater plants have R&D facilities? Like, how are you guys different, and what are you working on?
Yeah, so big picture, we've been doing R&D for decades. In fact, one of our treatment plant was a patented process that's in textbooks from the 80s. And so this has really been in our DNA for decades. And so now we've grown into having 23 folks in our R&D group. We have 5 PhDs, 8 people working on PhDs, because what we found is we're always researching ways to keep our ratepayer costs low. And that's just really ingrained in us. And so a lot of our research right now is focused on process intensification and decarbonization. And we've got some really great success stories on where we've seen ROI. And so what's happened is as we continue to see ROI, we've continued to expand our research efforts. That group has just continued to grow and grow and grow, because they've just that return on the investment has just been so important. But we are very unique in the country in that sense, that there's only really a handful of utilities that really focus on R&D. We are just one of those unique entities where part of it is governance structure, right? Because, how do you convince your board that's trying to be elected that you want to create a whole new R&D group, right? Like that's just becomes infinitely hard. Or your utility is tied with a city, and so now you're competing against fire and schools and police, right? Like, so then that just becomes even more difficult. And so part of the reason why we are where we are is, again, I would go all the way back to our governance structure and our mission and how we're created, and those kinds of things is kind of how we ended up in the place where we are, where we have this really awesome R&D group that is doing so much amazing stuff, and we can get more into that for sure.
Yeah, let's kind of dig deeper into, you said process intensification and decarbonization are kind of the two things you're focusing on. But yeah, let's take a spread of what you think the most interesting things that you guys are working on, and where do you stand, and what also have you worked on? Like, what's kind of in the public now, or what are you actively using? You mentioned this patent from the 80s, just so the audience can kind of get a spectrum of what you have worked on and what you are working on.
Yeah, so that plant in the 80s called our Virginia Initiative plant. It's in Norfolk next to the ODU University, but that now has been superseded by so many other innovations that have occurred since then. And so now, fast forward to today, we have the first plant in the world doing mainstream deammonification. We are probably one of the only utilities in the country that collects royalties for our innovations. We share a lot of our innovations with DC Water. So again, that first plant in the world is in York County, and it's using this bacteria called Animox. Again, because remember, most wastewater processes are biological, and a scientist had discovered this bacteria back in the 90s. So it's relatively newly discovered bacteria. And so this research took about a decade to get to where we are, where we can use this technology at mainstream. But bottom line is, we save $1 million a year in O&M, because by harnessing this bacteria, it uses 50% less power, 80% less chemicals, and we avoided $100 million CapEx investment just using this technology. So the whole idea of process intensification is, don't build more concrete tanks or any of that. You can use your existing tanks, use this Animox bacteria, you get more capacity, remove nutrients better. So this whole idea of process intensification in the wastewater process world is really where a lot of focus is, because that's the easiest, cheapest, best way to expand your plant cost effectively.
Can you kind of generally walk me through what the cost breakdown of running a wastewater plant generally is? Like, what percentages are you spending kind of across the board? Because you said you guys save $1 million a year with the Xanthomox bacteria on a capex that would have cost 10 million.
100 million.
100 million. Sorry, I was off by a factor of 10. And yeah, what is it like? Like, what are you generally looking at with with who you serve and how much money you bring in? Kind of, what does that capital stack look like from a revenue perspective as well as from a cost, as much as you can share?
Sure, for sure. It's all public information. So on a simple sense, for every dollar, about half of that goes to capex, about 25% goes to opex, and then 25% is people. Is pretty much the breakdown. And so we get the biggest bang for our buck and by the ability to reduce capex, and that's really the biggest thing with process intensification. So, one of the second, probably our most prolific patent that we receive the most royalty revenues is called Indents. It's a gravimetric selector. It's basically a hydrocyclone, and what it does is it adds 30 to 50% capacity to your plant by installing this hydrocyclone. And so, it's installed at over 100 locations around the world. As an example, Denver installed it and they saved $66 million by doing that. Again, like, you don't have to add more concrete tanks, add this hydrocyclone and the activated sludge process. So market size, any wastewater plant that has activated sludge as part of the process, which is basically all of them, could use this technology. So it's not surprising that this is our most prolific technology. Doubling rate is every year and a half. Yeah, so it's really starting to take off over the last few years.
Wow. Can you kind of just very simply explain the activated sludge process? Because I think it's actually really interesting. I think for our audience, it'd be great if you kind of explained the activated sludge process as well as how the hydrocyclone helps with efficiency for a wastewater plant that's using that.
So I am not the best person to explain the activated sludge process or the hydrocyclone. So I don't want to talk about that because there's a lot that goes into some of these technologies. But the coolest thing about the gravimetric selector is like there's really no moving parts. It's just basically using hydraulics to separate the bacteria that you want that goes out of the bottom of the hydrocyclone versus what you keep in. And so that's how it ends up adding capacity to your plant by basically keeping the better bugs and wasting out the ones that you don't want. So
makes sense. I want to jump into the life and story of Jay. I always feel like the guests that we have on here are super interesting, and for folks that are looking to also get careers in water or just interested in kind of what that world looks like. How did you get into this position? Like, what's your background? Did you come from a family of people that have been in water, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So it's pretty neat story. So when I graduated from college, my degree is in civil engineering. I went in and worked in consulting. And, I just wasn't feeling fulfilled because, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's like you go work in consulting and you're making a profit for the shareholders and stuff like that. And so I didn't get my first taste of public service until I worked for the city of Virginia Beach. And I did that for about 6 or 7 years. And I remember my first day there, I'm like, holy moly, like, I get to work, if I work so hard, I'm doing it for the community and bettering the community that I live in. And that's where I really fell in love with public service. And so fast forward to 2005, I got my first job with HRSD, and I've been here ever since. And so I was chief of planning and analysis. I was doing GIS, capital planning, data analysis, those kinds of, and hydraulic modeling was more of my expertise. And then, HRC has this really cool program where we actually pay 100% for school. So in 2013, I got my MBA from the College of William and Mary. And so that's where I fell in love with finance, because being able to mix a technical background with money is a very powerful combination. And so if you have anybody that's listening today that's an engineer, I would 100%, it'll change your life if you go back and get your MBA. Because at the end of the day, it will help you make good decisions. And so as part of getting my MBA, I learned how to build financial models. And so we had always known that we could take this one treatment plant offline and send it to another plant that had capacity, right? Like, it's a very simple problem. This plant has capacity. Let's just send it there. And so, when we built the financial model, we thought we would save 130 million, right? Which is a lot of money, right? So that plant went offline in December of 2021. We did postmortem, updated all the estimates on what it cost to transfer the flow. We ended up saving 239 million 30-year NPV. So But really just highlighting and showcasing the power of combining a technical background with a financial background. And so in 2015, I got this incredible opportunity to become the chief financial officer. So I did that for 6.5 years. And so I love that. So, I mean, for an engineer, it's finance is relatively easy because it's numbers just with dollar signs, right? And so all the quantitative parts just come a lot easier, and the finance side and issuing bonds and things like that, I just thought was just so much fun. And so having that combination led me to this position, and so I've been in this role for about 3.5 years now. I just think again it's a good story of folks that are looking into potentially getting their MBA, because I was always threatening to get my MBA. That it has just been literally a game changer in my life, and has led to me to where I am today. And like, had I not had the finance side, I think my job currently would be infinitely more difficult, not understanding all the different, like now I know every account code, right? Like not having that deeper understanding of decisions that you make, how does that really impact your finances and debt service coverage ratios and things like that. You just have a bigger, better perspective of the organization when you have that kind of breadth of education and knowledge and experience. And so, yeah, so that's kind of an interesting, weird background of kind of how I got to where I am. But today, so to me, this is a dream job. I love the technical side and I love the finance side. And so, yeah, I'm loving it every day.
You've probably come across a ton of interesting technologies, especially within your R&D group. We were just talking before I hit the record button about your trip to Denmark. What's like one really, really interesting technology that comes to mind that you feel that I or the audience just don't know yet that you'd love to spotlight? And it could be in wastewater or not. It can just be like, hey, this is a really cool, interesting water tech.
Well, I will tell you about one that is still evolving, and it's maybe something that a lot of people aren't paying attention to. Well, there's going to be this huge supply demand imbalance for granular activated carbon. So I think a lot of folks in the water world are keeping an eye on PFAS, this new PFAS regulation. Some people have called it the forever chemical. Well, they don't call it forever chemical for nothing, because it's really hard to destroy and get rid of. And EPA has this new requirement that all drinking water utilities have to manage, are being regulated on PFAS in drinking water, and they have to have all their systems in place by 2031. Well, the majority, there's only two technologies that are known to get rid of PFAS out of drinking water. That's granular activated carbon and ion exchange. Well, what's going to happen is there's not that many granular activated carbon facilities in the US, let alone reactivation facilities. And so you're going to have this huge supply demand imbalance. If all these water utilities are installing granular activated carbon, the demand for carbon is going to, GAC is going to just go up exponentially, right? And that price is going to go up exponentially. And so, one of our bigger projects, we are installing GAC. The new tech, the missing link is, how do you reactivate that GAC and actually destroy the PFAS? So the only technology to reactivate GAC, to reuse it, is incineration. But what happens to the PFAS? Does it just get into the air, and when it rains, it's now into the rivers and it's everywhere else, right? It doesn't, maybe or maybe not, it doesn't destroy it. And so I was just at the Jefferson Labs. It's the Thomas Jefferson National Particle Accelerator Laboratory. It's a DOE facility that really focuses on nuclear physics. And they've come up with a technology that could destroy PFAS concentrate, could also regenerate GAC. This just has so much potential in terms of, I feel like to deal with the whole PFAS problem, it's going to take these DOE PhD scientists to solve, because of how strong that fluorine bond is in PFAS. It's not going to be some high schooler's project that's going to be able to solve the PFAS issue, right? It's going to take a particle accelerator or electron beams to destroy the PFAS. And so we were just there with them this week. And so we're working on a partnership with them on this whole issue. And so just keep an eye on, using an electron beam for PFAS is a little bit mind-blowing. We've published a paper with Jefferson Labs before on removing 1,4-dioxane from the water. So we know it can work in our water field. And so we've been nudging them to, hey, what other things can the electron beam do that can help solve water problems? And so this is where, we had met with them this week. And so this technology looks pretty promising. And so we're really excited about working with them on trying to accelerate it. So
really, really cool. I'm going to keep an eye out for for electron beams that can destroy PFAS. That's awesome. That's really cool stuff. Jay, I ask everybody one final question before we sign off, and that is, do you have a book, a movie, or a TV show that has just impacted the way that you look at the world?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that there's any one thing that's impacted the way that I look at the world, like relative to any type of media. But I will say that I'll just since I don't have one, I'll give you my favorite quote is be prepared for luck. And to me that means that get your education, always treat people with respect, just always doing the right thing, grind, work hard, because you never know when that opportunity comes up. So for example, how I got that CFO position, like, you know what I mean? You just got to be prepared for luck. And so that's what I would say. It's like, I wouldn't say the media per se or anything like that has really influenced me, but that's probably being prepared for luck is probably more impactful for me.
Awesome. I love that. Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me. This is a lot of fun.
Of course. Yeah, this was great. We'll have you on soon.